Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for us to be able to give this presentation. We had hoped it would be actual, but it's virtual, so nothing can stop us. So this is very pleasurable. Kate and I will be sharing this presentation, but we did do the book, and so the book is very useful. It will have much more detail than we're going to be able to present in this talk. But I also wanted to say that there are many memory institutions. The Illinois State Historical Museum has library, has information about New Philadelphia and the Frank McWorter family. There's a historical society in Pike County. There's a museum in Barry. There are websites that the New Philadelphia Association has. Archaeologists at the University of Maryland, University of Illinois have extensive websites with great amounts of detail. And of course, the New Philadelphia Association has a very important Facebook page that will keep you up to date. So we hope this will interest you in becoming part of our extended network. We have a newsletter, and so if you go to the New Philadelphia Association, you can share your email with us and we can stay in touch. We have a story to tell, and we hope you will enjoy it and we'll learn from it. But we'd like to start this presentation, as we always do, with an acknowledgement of comparable local history in our host environment, in this case, Normal, Illinois.
It's always really exciting for us to find out what is happening in various counties, mostly in Illinois, where we've spoken, in the same time as the heyday of New Philadelphia. So this is just some tidbits which may be already known to you if you're in McLean County, and otherwise not, maybe new. So one of the most remarkable things is the Pantograph, which is still the newspaper in Bloomington Normal. It came into existence in, I think, 1837. And it was known for actually publishing appeals for funds to help freedom seekers. So it was a very anti-slavery newspaper for that during that abolitionist time. And this photograph here of a Normal elementary school class in 1890 really conveys the fact that Black people really settled in Normal, in Bloomington, and it went on to become an industrial era city, which was not true so much for New Philadelphia. On the right, a very early freedom paper for a woman named Tabitha Fulton, who lived in the county. And then just tidbits that we want to share. There was a community of abolitionists that called themselves Mount Hope. There was a remarkable incident of a Black man testifying in court against a white man at some point in the 1850s. And I could mention right away that the 1850s were one of the most polarized decades around the question of freedom and slavery. And McLean County was also polarized, but there was a sense in which, from our look at it, from this pamphlet that's called A History of African Americans in McLean County, suggests that the abolitionists and the freedom seekers had the upper hand in this debate. And of course, Lincoln was in and out of the county and had friends in the county. One thing that was really special was as early as 1835, there's a woman named Rosanna Johnson who was able to arrange for her, not only her own freedom papers, but the $1,000 bond that she needed, and someone put it up for her. So that she could stay in Illinois. That was one of the many Black laws that really hemmed Black people in Illinois and made the term free state a little bit shaky.
The story of New Philadelphia is part of the history of Illinois, of course, but more specifically, Pike County, Illinois. And as you can see from this map that's on the left of the slide, the 1820 map that shows just how big Pike County was, going all the way to the northern border of Illinois, including Cook County and Chicago. Pike County was well established in the history of Illinois. And if you look to where the arrow is, you can see the actual size of Pike County today. Within Pike County, what we're really talking about is a town that was established in Hadley Township. And it was a very positive view of what a town could be. As you can see from the map of the town, There were very large streets, and it was well laid out for settlement, as many towns were at that time in history.
So just to contextualize it, and some of this same history is echoed in McLean County as well. Native Americans were being removed from Illinois, and they were being removed from parts east. So there was a flow of Native Americans across the state, of course, and European Americans coming in. But right around the same time as New Philadelphia was founded, which was 1836, there was something called the Trail of Death, which is where the Potawatomi Native Americans were driven, were marched across Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri to end up in Kansas. And this was a very deadly trip that was made in inclement, dangerous weather with people not well protected from the elements. And it passed just a few miles north of New Philadelphia. So all these things made this period very fraught and very full of anguish. Black Hawk fought in the War of 1812 and then again in 1832, and that was somewhere a little bit north of where Quincy is shown on this black and white map.
So the narrative, the anti-slavery narrative, the settlement narrative of the United States, that's really what it was, which was a settler colony. Often the silence is about the indigenous people that were here. But another silence really is part of an affirmation. The affirmation of the political and moral struggle against slavery has to do with these two men, Sam Clemens, who we know by his nom de plume, Mark Twain, and Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. Now, what's interesting about these two men is that they both represented an abolitionist sentiment, but you know, history and life itself is a lot more complex than the sort of the simple summation of good versus evil. And there's a story to be told about each of these men. Now, as you can see in this slide, the book on the left, Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream, is written by Lerone Bennett, a great African-American historian. He demonstrates, reminds us that Lincoln was from Kentucky. And while he was a very far-thinking man, he also brought with him sentiments of the slavery culture of Kentucky. So he was known to have a sense of humor that wasn't exactly respectful of Black people. We learn this from the writings of James Ashley, the abolitionist from Ohio, who wrote extensively about this. And of course, Lerone Bennett documents that in his book. Of course, Lincoln was the leader of the anti-slavery Civil War. And so we honor him for that. But at the same time, we recognize his humanity and his being part of the culture out of which he came. On the other hand, we have the story of Mark Twain, Sam Clemens, as retold by Darrell Dempsey, a lawyer from Hannibal, who now lives in Quincy. Hannibal was a slave city, slave market city in Missouri, a slave state. Quincy, on the other hand, in Illinois, was a great abolitionist city. And as it turns out, what Sam Clemens did not say is that he learned about slavery not by observing others, but by observing his own family, his father and his uncle, who were engaged in owning and selling slaves. So here we have two books that really are part of our need to rethink history in its full complexity. But the point is that the dominant aspect of these two men is that they contributed to the anti-slavery struggle. And that is very much what the story of New Philadelphia is all about. Now, it's important to talk about the actual agency of African Americans themselves. Of course, Sam Clemens and Abraham Lincoln were great abolitionists, but we also have to know that African Americans were agents of change for their own liberation, which is really kind of a lesson that nobody can free you as much as you have to free yourself. And what we can find in the history of this country is that beginning in 1830, African Americans began to meet in the National Negro Convention movement that occurred at a national level and at a state level, where Black people gathered in order to discuss how to get free. And in Illinois, there were at least 2 state meetings that took place, one in Chicago and one in Alton. And as you can see here in the text, their goals were really simultaneous with the essential development of democracy and freedom in the United States overall. So for example, the first point, we complain of being taxed without the right to vote. In other words, complaining against taxation without representation. Or the third point, we pay school taxes without the privilege of sending our children to public schools. Again, the idea that democracy should be inclusive of everyone. And this, of course, is in the state of Illinois, a so-called free state. Now, more specific to our story of New Philadelphia, here are the 2 founders. And I say 2 founders because we often think of Free Frank McWorter, but when we think of Free Frank McWorter, we have to think of Free Lucy McWorter, his wife. They met in Illinois. They met in Pike County. I'm getting ahead of myself. They met in Pulaski County, Kentucky, when Frank was brought to Kentucky by his father, who was also his owner. And Lucy was in a neighboring plantation, and they met, developed a relationship, and had children together, which we will discuss. As you can see from this slide, one of the great achievements, which we will mention again, is that Frank was an enterprising, even entrepreneurial person who was able to acquire money, even while a slave. And by so doing, was in a position to purchase the freedom of his wife first. She was pregnant, and they wanted the next children to be born free. And then later he bought himself and totally had enough money to directly and indirectly purchase 16 family members out of slavery. So as you can see from this slide, some details about Frank, Lucy, and their children. And as you can see, the experience of purchasing family members took place over a long period of time. And it took place by having to go from Illinois back to Kentucky to purchase family members. And it's very important to think about. See, we don't have data about the details, sort of like our own lives. You know, we don't have details, but we have memories, and we have to connect the memories that we have with our own historical imagination. And this historical imagination then puts us on a journey to find evidence as to whether or not our imagination makes sense. This is very important. And as you could see from the data in this slide, the age at which people, and the date at which people were freed, and then how many years they lived free, so that the people who experienced slavery and freedom, really, this is part of the great American story, and there's more to say about this. The one thing I want to point out here that's interesting is that the women lived longer than the men. Now, I'm here to tell you, as a member of the McWhorter family, I want to catch up. I want to live as long as the women.
So one of the children of Frank and Lucy that we know the most about is Solomon McWhorter. And Solomon is actually Gerald's great grandfather. This here is a picture of him and the woman he married, Frances Jane Coleman McWhorter. At the bottom there is a tiny little excerpt of a story that was written by another descendant who's no longer with us. And her archive is at Wilberforce University in Ohio. And it's a story of what it was like for Frank to go and get Solomon, for them to travel together back to Illinois. And one of the things that the story tells is how Frank was explaining what freedom was going to be like to someone who was 20 years old and had never experienced it. And some of what he explained included the fact that he was going to have to help take care of the family, that he might even end up being the patriarch of the family because he was the oldest son on the scene, because the very first son was in Canada at that point. And also that he would have to take some responsibility for the community, that's how agricultural communities and families survived, was by helping each other, barn raisings, and everybody go over to that farm and help on something, and then go to the other farm to help on something a few weeks later. So the excerpt at the bottom says, Solomon was not as outgoing as his father. He was a grown man when his father purchased his freedom. The years weighed heavily on him. So he was a quiet person, but at the same time, he did become the family patriarch once his father had passed away. Now, the letter in the middle is the letter he's writing to Jane, as she was called. And it's really very gentle. I would like it if we could get married on Tuesday and get home on Thursday, if it would be according to your feelings. Tuesday is the 29th of this month, I believe. Any arrangement that will be happy to you, be pleasing to you, please write to me. I want our interests to be one. So it's really remarkable that we hear this that we hear his voice here. It's unclear. We don't know his literacy, so it might not have been written by him, but we think that he did have literacy, because some of the other things he did were quite remarkable. So different stories are sort of layered in this slide, but the first one on top says, your cousin Solomon is very busy making molasses from Chinese sugarcane, which is what they called sorghum, which he raises on 13 acres of his land. He makes about a barrel a day, which fetches $16. He's excellent if made goods. So you see, we are getting quite independent of the South as to our sweetening. This was a letter written by the woman here in this white bonnet who farmed next door to the McWhorters. The Shipman family and the McWhorter family farmed next to each other for at least 50 or 60 years. And she wrote letters to her offspring who migrated to Hawaii. And the letters remained there intact up to today. So what's in this paragraph? Well, first of all, cousin Solomon. There was a great feeling of closeness that the family, that she would call Solomon their cousin. And then this Chinese sugarcane, getting independent of the South. This was really important to abolitionists because they didn't want to buy what was called blood-stained sugar. There was a boycott movement that lasted for several decades leading up to the Civil War. They didn't want to encourage the Southern economy in that way. And sorghum could be grown in cooler latitudes like Illinois. And then finally, also his entrepreneurial farming. He sold crops. He sold not crops. He sold a product of his crops. And then behind that, you see a patent. Now, he was the 5th African American in the country to be awarded a patent, and the first one in Illinois, and it was for an evaporating pan design. Just like maple syrup, sorghum syrup has to be extracted first from the plant and then boiled down, simmered down until it's thick enough to be and sweet enough. Now, there's other things that she writes over the years to the family in Hawaii, including writing about Lucy, who was one of the daughters of, Lucy, the mother. She was the wife of Frank. What am I saying? She writes, and Lucy has been sick, but is getting better. She bears her age remarkably well. I suppose she must be 100 years old. Well, she lived to be over 100. And she writes about Solomon's child. So they were exchanging news back and forth. And these pictures at the bottom are when we were able to go and meet the descendant who has the letter collection in her possession. And she was very happy to share it and very excited because they didn't realize that they had been an abolitionist family. So it was really exciting news for them to participate in this history gathering.
We had to go to Hawaii, which is where these pictures were taken. Now, one of the ways in which we all know that we get to even meet our family as they disperse throughout the country and world really is in family reunions. And so here we see a family reunion in 1920 in New Philadelphia. And the woman we've been talking about, Jane, the wife of Solomon, is the woman sitting in the middle of this photograph. And at the bottom on the right, the little boy sitting there, that's my father, Festus. And at the top, the second to the right man, the smaller, shorter guy, is Arthur, my grandfather. So this is a very important picture because it includes not only members of the McWhorter family, but close relatives and relatives by marriage, etc. So for example, in the top left corner is a man, Hermes Zimmerman, who not only was a religious man, but he was a musician and actually wrote tunes, got them published by a company he set up in Hadley Township. And this is not only important historically, but we actually, one of our dear friends and colleagues in the New Philadelphia Association, Marinelle Horton, she was able to find the music, and we actually have played the music and recorded the music. So Hermes Zimmerman's music lives. And but these are the McWhorters of that period in New Philadelphia. Now this group of 5 people, this quintet, this is my father and his siblings. These are the last McWhorters that grew up in New Philadelphia. So on the left, you see the picture of them as children in New Philadelphia. And on the right, you see them as adults gathering together in Chicago, Illinois. Now, the woman on the right in this picture, Thelma of Mcwhorter, she really was the family historian and also sort of the matriarch that kept everybody in communication. And just to tell a quick story about her, and this is a very important story about family documents. Thelma was a student at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And in a class with Charles Johnson, the famous sociologist, there was a discussion that many Black families did not have records of their family history. And Thelma indicated that she had records, that the McWhorters had records. She went back to Illinois and was able to gather documents together, and the elders allowed her to take some of the documents back to Fisk. Those are the documents that remain, because there was subsequently a fire and many documents were lost. But the documents that were saved served as the basis for her daughter, who became a graduate student at the University of Chicago in history under the famous historian John Hope Franklin, to help her begin her research that led to her doctoral dissertation and a University of Kentucky book, Free Frank, which is also a very important reference work on everything we have to say. Now, the actual story we want to tell with that sort of background and introduction is the fact that New Philadelphia was an abolitionist village. And that's a powerful thing to say because, you know, the United States was really based on slavery. There was more wealth in the ownership of slaves and the production of cotton than the rest of the wealth in the entire country, the entire economy of the country. Most of the presidents of the United States were slave owners. So slavery was the foundation of the United States. New Philadelphia was an abolitionist village and is associated with these 7 ways to freedom. We often think of, if there was a way to get to freedom, it was associated with New Philadelphia. Even while slaves, Frank worked as freemen. We'll get to this in a minute. They became freedom seekers. They ran to freedom. They bought themselves out of freedom. They established a town. They helped others run. New Philadelphia became a station on the Underground Railroad, as now formally recognized by the National Park Service. They fought in the Civil War. They took up arms to free all Black people from slavery. And then they lived free, 20 miles from a slave state of Missouri. These were Black people that owned land and had guns and represented freedom that manifests itself as part of the democracy that the United States has always been trying to build.
So this working and trading while still enslaved and then later as freedmen and women, this is the first of these 7 ways, which really were practiced not just by the McWhorter family, but by all the families that we've been able to dig into in any depth in New Philadelphia, including the Irick family. So it's really exciting that you all would be here. There's a picture in our book of Gerald in front of a haystack when he was not even 5 years old. And we showed it to Harry Wright, who's an Irick who lived most of his life in Pike County. And there was a horse standing next to the haystack. And he said, I know the name of that horse. So even in the modern day, the Irick descendants were in and out of the McWhorters' lives. So visiting on farms, working on farms with each other and that sort of thing. So the working here that's illustrated is when Frank was still east, he was able to negotiate with his owner, who was also his father, right? The ability to go after working hours, outside of working hours, and mine this ingredient for gunpowder, which is called saltpeter. So it's scraped out of caves like you see here, but then it has to be processed, has to be boiled and turned into this very pure chemical that you see at the bottom. So he had the resources and degree of freedom while still enslaved to do this kind of work. And this was part of his finding income, because of course gunpowder was useful in the frontier for hunting, and also in the wars. The War of 1812 was around the same time as he was doing this, and so on. So they worked and traded in slavery and as freedmen and women. Second of all, they ran. I spoke briefly about the first son, whose name was Frank as well. So Frank Jr. Frank Jr. lit out for Canada sometime in the 1820s from Kentucky. And we don't yet know the details of that, because we don't know that anyone's been able to do the research on the in Ontario province, which would bring to light that McWhorter family up there, because he settled in Sandwich, and the outside of the letter, they folded letters up and made envelopes out of them. So this is the envelope side of a letter that's addressed to him, Mr. Francis McWhorter, Sandwich, Upper Canada, by way of Detroit. So there was correspondence, and the letters that we are able to read say, we don't know yet when we're going to be coming, but we're going to be coming soon. And they're necessarily vague, but they're speaking about movement of people, which can only be freedom seekers. And there's a picture of this important church there that's in Sandwich. This is a church that was built on the land where the freedom seekers had worshiped just under the trees until they were able to make the bricks and then build this church in the 1850s. So there was a community of freedmen and freedwomen at this spot in Ontario, right across from Detroit. And you can imagine that they did much the same as Quincy did. They looked for people coming across the river and helped them build their lives in a more free land. The red and white and black map on this slide illustrates how well documented the Ohio freedom trails are. There are not so many of them as visible in Indiana and Illinois, but as I was saying earlier about our talks all over Illinois, wherever we go, we find evidence of abolitionism and freedom seeking in the different counties of Illinois. So we feel that we could probably, with enough collaboration and work, we could draw as many red lines in Illinois as there are in Ohio. Just there was this drive to get free, to get north. And recently there's even findings that people even went south to Mexico to get free if they were closer to that direction. So that's the second way to freedom, running.
Of course, another way is this whole question of being able to purchase yourself out of bondage. And as I said, the legacy of Frank McWhorter is that 16 family members were purchased out of slavery. But they weren't the only family in New Philadelphia and the surrounding area that did so. The Walkers, this was a family, an African-American family that came out of Missouri. They too were able to buy themselves out of slavery and settle in Hadley Township near and in New Philadelphia. And what's interesting is that the Walker women, including my great-grandmother, my grandmother, Ophelia, married McWhorter men. And so these families were very close. But purchasing oneself out of slavery, even the whole question of negotiating a price, and it was a major act of freedom itself.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the fourth way to freedom was founding a town and calling it New Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And there were other Philadelphias. There's a Philadelphia in Ohio, and certainly there's the original Philadelphia, which is in Pennsylvania, and was known for being kind of the HQ of abolitionism before the Civil War. So this town was really a beacon, and many towns were getting founded, and many people were getting rich by founding towns and selling the lots to the towns. And there was a profusion of towns that not all of them survived to the 20th century, of course, because some pulled ahead. But Chicago was smaller than New Philadelphia when New Philadelphia was first getting started. Now, this is a plat of New Philadelphia, so it's very similar to the map you saw earlier, and it's signed by family members who the signature is blocked by the printed matter there, but one of the signatures is from one of those ancestors of that woman in Hawaii. So the IRICs go all the way back, the Shipmans go all the way back. There are these relationships, but in the 1900s and also in the 21st century. So in the front here is an act to change the name of Free Frank. As soon as he had founded a town, it became obvious that he needed the right to protect his property. And this law gave him that right because Black people did not have that right. Like I said, in McLean County, it was remarkable that a Black man could actually testify in court. This act was put forward by the state representative from Pike County to enable Frank to sue and be sued, plead and be impeded, purchase and convey real and personal property. And it also made his last name official. And his last name became McWhorter without an H to distinguish it from McWhorter with an H, which was his father's last name, his former owner's last name. And just in the last year or so, we've been able to do the research that brought to light the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a state representative who was actually in the state capitol, which was in Vandalia at that point, on the very day that this bill was voted on and passed. Now, they didn't record the votes for name laws. There were other name laws besides the McWhorter law, but being as how his close friend was the guy who put forward the bill, we feel pretty confident that Lincoln would have voted for this bill.
In the Illinois, there is a whole process of looking for Lincoln and then acknowledging where Lincoln either practiced law or had some activity in that local area. And so we have established a sign in Barry, Illinois, near New Philadelphia. So people are looking for Lincoln. We found Lincoln and his connection to New Philadelphia and the McWhorter family.
So we've really spoken about this, but it's worth repeating to discover the trails that people have ascertained in all these Midwestern states. And it was in the last 10 years that New Philadelphia was finally officially recognized in the National Park Service's Network to Freedom, which is their sort of officially approved list of locations that are verified as being spots connected to the Underground Railroad.
One of the interesting aspects of this geographical documentation of the freedom seekers is that many times it's the abolitionists of means, the people who own homes and could have secret rooms, or people who had the wherewithal to transport people from one area to the next on the Freedom Road. But again, historical imagination. As an African American, if I was trying to get free and I was roaming through the countryside going north, the first thing I would do is start looking for other Black people. And just on the odds, and asking them, what's safe, where to go, who to trust. So wherever there were African Americans located, in these so-called free states, undoubtedly we'd be able to find some kind of connection. So as Kate pointed out, the trails of freedom have yet to be documented.
One of the family stories that was handed down in the McWhorter family was that it was said that if you could get to McWhorter, if you could get to New Philadelphia, you could get a pair of shoes and a horse, and those McWhorter boys would help you get to Canada. That expression persisted. And when the archaeologists and historians came to New Philadelphia to do their 10 years of archaeological and historical research, they found out that there were 2 cobblers in this tiny village making shoes. Did that many people who were permanent residents need shoes? It didn't seem to add up numerically. Second of all, it was clear, it was known that Frank Sr. had the franchise to round up any and all wild horses in the area. Well, how many horses again do you need? So a pair of shoes, a horse, and then we know that there was Frank Jr. in Canada, and there was correspondence within the family in the 2 different locations. So and there are similar stories in other families, in other New Philadelphia families. For instance, the Eckelbergers. The Eckelbergers had a wagon very much like this, and there's only 2 of these wagons still existing in the United States, and it is a double-bottomed wagon where people can hide in the bottom and you can put produce or hay or something else on top, and they'll be hidden and you can transport them. So it's really remarkable to know that a wagon like this was in operation out of New Philadelphia. And we know this because the little girl with the yellow circle around her face is the one who gave the oral history that told about this. And she further told about how her grandparents, who were pictured here up above the picture of the school children, their grandmother would wring a chicken's neck and throw it out into the yard when bounty hunters came by, and the family was housing freedom seekers. The freedom seekers would then run out into the tall grass beyond the yard of the house, beyond the family garden. And the chicken would be running around without its head, and the dog would be barking, and the bounty hunters would say, "Oh, the dog's just barking about chickens," and they would keep on moving. They wouldn't realize what they had just passed by. So she was very proud to tell this story to the history students who collected oral histories some time back. And her sisters are there in red, and then Gerald's grandfather is there circled in green.
My father.
Sorry, your father is circled there in green. And this is a New Philadelphia school photo from 1925.
Now, another aspect of the story, as I mentioned at the very beginning, of memory institutions. And in this instance, we're talking about the Berry Baptist Church having its own records and therefore is a memory institution. Now, one of the interesting documented experiences is that in 1833, and I'll quote what's at the bottom here, the church agreed to send a letter and messengers to meet a convention of the sister churches at Blue River. This is Free Will Baptist on the 2nd of January, second Saturday in June, next to arrange an association, and agree that the clerk write a letter for inspection tomorrow, and that Brother Martin, William Freeman, and Brother Free Frank bear it. Now, this is mainly a church of Euro-Americans, but they're embracing this African-American to be part of a delegation to form an organization of Free Will Baptists, who we know were more abolitionists than not. So again, historical imagination. What was the agenda? Were they discussing freedom? Were they discussing freedom seekers? Well, we don't know that as a matter of proof, but we're asking the question and we're looking for evidence. So this is very important. And the church historian was very anxious when we came to a meeting to show us the document that she had in her possession. Very important historical information.
It's also noteworthy that was only 2 years after Frank had arrived with his 3 freeborn children and his wife and Frank Jr., who came back from Canada to help them make the trip. So just 2 years later, before he even founded the town, he had this kind of stature in the community, and they put trust in him in this way. Now, the sixth way that New Philadelphians fought for freedom was to fight in the Civil War. And of course, there were European Americans from New Philadelphia who fought, but they were able to register, they were able to muster in bodies, in military groups that were local. The African Americans who wanted to sign up had to go further away. It was segregated military, and these five people actually went to Michigan to sign up. But they came back to, they survived, and they came back to New Philadelphia and are buried in the New Philadelphia Cemetery. So this star on a short stake here is what the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the veterans organization after the Civil War, placed on every grave of a veteran of the war. And then this button came off a Union jacket, and this was found on the site.
And lastly, of course, is this question of living freedom 20 miles from slavery. The experience is hard to imagine. 20 miles from slavery, facing people who were trying to capture the freedom seekers. But what we do know is that the history has been maintained as oral history in the family. I can testify to this because I grew up with this history. But what's really interesting is that we always thought of it as our family history. And only really in the last decade or more, maybe 2 decades, come to understand that this is a story that is far bigger than just one family. It's a story of all the people who passed through New Philadelphia as freedom seekers. It's a story about the state of Illinois. It's a story that is exemplary of the fact that the racist lies about Black people need to be corrected. And they have to be corrected because we have this story, and this story helps us to then find many, many more such stories.
So in the modern era, New Philadelphia has earned a tremendous amount of recognition, both locally and nationally. So local farmers put that red stone where it goes. They were very determined that the site would be marked. Another farmer brought those cabins and reconstructed them. Those are 1800s era cabins that are set on original New Philadelphia foundations. The highway is named for Frank McWhorter along that way. National Register of Historic Places, Juliet Walker there, the daughter of Thelma, who wrote the book about Free Frank, Shirley McWhorter, and there's a Shirley in the audience, and I'm glad there's someone named Shirley in the audience, because Shirley McWhorter Moss is the one who made that bust of Frank from her imagination, feeling all and looking at all the family pictures and all the family faces that she could get her hands on to reconstruct what Frank might have looked like. And then most recently, there is a bill that's in both the Senate Bill 3141, and the House 820, to make New Philadelphia a unit of the national park, so that it will really get the recognition, so people will be able to visit it as part of their chasing all the different national parks in their regions and in the country. So really earned the recognition that it deserved, that the word is still getting out.
There is a literature about New Philadelphia. Of course, our book is the most recent publication, but here are several others. The Pike County Historical Society published this book, this pamphlet, large pamphlet, which was really part of an oral history project. The next one in 1981 was a self-published book by Helen McWhorter Simpson, who lived in Cleveland. And she was very careful to not only describe Solomon's patent, but another patent by a McWhorter that was about what he called his flying machine, that even the Pentagon came to examine his flying machine, which contributed to the development of the helicopter. The next book, Free Frank, that's Juliet's doctoral dissertation. The special issue of a journal of archaeology that reported on the research over a decade in New Philadelphia. And then the last book, 2011, is by Paul Shackle, an anthropologist, archaeologist at the University of Maryland, who was part of all of the archaeological digs.
So these pictures really tell the story of remembering New Philadelphia visually. So there's the woman who pulled out the church minutes sitting there in her wicker chair. Here is one of the Summers archaeological teams at the site, digging up as Gerald says, digging in his family's garbage heaps, which is a very strange feeling, finding out more about what's happening in New Philadelphia. These are McWhorter descendants sitting on the porch, sitting at the porch swing. These are the crew in the middle in the plaid shirts were the ones who reconstructed the cabins. And there's actually an augmented reality app for the iPhone where you can go and hear more stories about New Philadelphia when you're on the site.
The picture of sitting on the porch just above Pike County Express, the woman sitting second from the right is Lonnie Wilson. And I'm so glad to see Lonnie is part of the audience for this presentation. And next to Lonnie is Shirley, who did the sculpture of Free Frank. And then the three men in the middle, that's Alan Jr. He's one of Thelma's oldest son. And then on the far left, you see Chris Fennell at the University of Illinois and his students who are archaeologists.
And these are just more visual mementos of this 200 years of history. A local family pulled out their family's stores records and opened it up to find all the different times that the McWhorters came in and bought sugar and coffee and other kinds of implements that their general store sold. The iron, the trivet for resting a hot iron on, that was dug up out of the ground in New Philadelphia. And then, of course, the school children's pictures are very important because there are often names associated with them. But the pamphlet at the top is quite remarkable because just as we found about the different counties in Illinois having such parallel stories around abolitionism and African Americans, that we feel that connections from there are just waiting to be discovered. The New Philadelphians were connected to the national discussions about freedom and slavery as represented in this pamphlet. So this is an 1829 pamphlet that makes a certain argument about how to get free, but at the bottom in handwriting that matches the handwriting of Clarissa Shipman when she was writing about Solomon McWhorter and his Chinese sugar cane, it says, "Please to read this soon and return it." Well, we know how hard it is to get people to bring back books they borrowed from you. This pamphlet is in the McWhorter family collection. So the McWhorters never returned the pamphlet. And I guess they stayed friends because we have no evidence of a blowout between the two families. Now, on the bottom right here, this woman in the dark dress with the white handkerchief around her neck, that is Frank's daughter, Sarah, who was asked to come back to Kentucky when the family that owned some of the relatives still, the son of that family wrote a letter which they received shortly after Frank Sr. had died that said, "Please come soon. My father's getting ready to sell Charlotte and he doesn't know I'm writing this letter and I'm not going to be able to stop him this time." So within a few weeks, they got the money together. She got on the road. She got to Kentucky, and in one day she bought several grandchildren of Frank and Lucy from three different children from three different owners. And she did not know how to read either. So just the sustained mission of freedom that the New Philadelphians and the McWhorters practice is remarkable in that photo.
Okay, we're just about to conclude our presentation, but want to make some quick points about the connection between our story and today. First of all, the town of New Philadelphia was part of the great American tradition of neighborliness, people who took care of each other, people who welcomed strangers, and certainly this was true with the Underground Railroad. And so the question for us today in our communities is, can we practice good neighborliness? Are we welcoming to strangers from faraway places, or even the people who live next door or the next block? So this is a very important question for us to think about when we think about New Philadelphia. Also, there is this question of freedom, this abolitionist village. Now in Pike County, for example, in the southern part of Pike County, it had the reputation of being white Pike. There were sundown towns in that part of Illinois where Black people were supposed to be out of town by sundown. But the freedom goal has always been the direction of politics and history in the country. Now today, unfortunately, we have a politics that is raising a question about this freedom, about this notion of democracy. So now is the time for us to rethink this question of democracy and freedom and reignite the desire. Because as we say, if New Philadelphia was possible, then maybe America is possible.
We really want you to see all the images here and logos associated with this slogan that really emerged from our giving talks about the book and really making even better sense about the book. So all these different media outlets and colleges and museums have helped us spread the story and continue to do so. So we're really grateful for all that. And this is just a dual portrait of Gerald and also Phil Bradshaw, who farms in Pike County and is the president of the New Philadelphia Association. So with that, we are at the end of our presentation and just want to put one thing in the chat, and that is a link to how to buy the book. So if you want to click on the chat button and open that up, you can click on that link and it will show you how to order the book, which takes you further into this than we're able to do in this brief amount of time. And we hope there's any questions that we can answer.
Thank you very much.
I had a question. First of all, it's a wonderful family and you have a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. What happened? Why did New Philadelphia decline and disappear?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, it existed as a formal town until the 1880s. And after that, when I say formal, I mean that at that point it lost its post office. But after that, it remained a settlement. People still live there. In fact, the last residents didn't leave until at least my direct family, my grandfather, in the 1950s. But others lived until the 1980s. And here we're not just talking about the exact town limits, but we're talking about the surrounding area and the people who identified with New Philadelphia. Now, specifically to your question, there are two main reasons. The big reason is people left to go to work. Economic realities drove people from area to area. And so, as Kate pointed out, it did not become an industrial area. It remained a farming area. And so, as we all know, farmers have larger families, but that required people to get jobs. And so men and women migrated to where they could get work. But the other reason, and this is research done by Chris Fennell, a professor at the University of Illinois, is when the railroad came through, it was on a trajectory to go directly through New Philadelphia, in which case New Philadelphia would have become a market town, and its connection to the railroad would, of course, led to great economic development. But there were people in Missouri that had a controlling interest in where the railroad was going to go. So as it approached New Philadelphia, it sort of hopped over it and then continued on a straight line. And so now, of course, there are two ways to look at it. We could either, again, historical imagination, because we don't have the facts. We can't sit down and talk to Frank. Either it was, damn, the railroad didn't come through New Philadelphia. Or it could be, great, we don't want that damn railroad messing with our town. So, the point is that the economic reality really changed everything. And of course, we know Chicago, which was, founded around that same time because of its location right on the lake, right near the ore producing. So it became a great steel center, a great transportation center, and so on, to become one of the great cities of the world. But it used to be in Pike County. Other questions or comments?
I know we had some. I know we had some questions from here in the room too. Did you want to?
What was the county seat of Pike County in the 1830s, when New Philadelphia began?
It was Atlas.
Pittsfield.
No, Atlas.
Atlas.
It was Atlas at first. It was Atlas at first, and then it became Pittsfield. Atlas was a town to the south.
With Peter, when Petersburg became and that was so often the case, with early pioneer towns disappearing, county seats would move. Can they still hear me?
Yes, they can.
I thought it was interesting. 1837. You're talking about Lincoln and Vandalia, and are you familiar with the resolution, the anti-slavery resolution that Lincoln put forth in state legislature? And it didn't really go anywhere, but it's pretty interesting that, he only got one other legislator to sign on. And, but it's often overlooked, pretty powerful statement that he made clear back in 1837, as a young guy, and he was just living in New Salem.
Yeah, it was the same year as the McWhorter law. Yeah.
I thought they probably.
It's so wonderful to hear from Rachel that your grandparents were Jacob and Elizabeth Eyrick. The Eyrick family stories need to be brought forward, and I'm sure that they are as exciting and meaningful as the Eckelbergers, the Walkers, and the McWhorters. We need to hear more and more of them.
If anyone else has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can drop them in the chat. I've also put in the chat a survey that it would be really helpful if you could fill it out for us too. It will be helpful for the library, and I'll pass along any comments that you have to McWhorters.
I was wondering how long you've been working on this, and I can't imagine the number of hours that you've spent.
Well, it's an interesting question because, first of all, I grew up with this. And so, but you only really get interested in genealogy when you have gray hair. And so as a child, I didn't really ask all the questions I have now. Because my father and his siblings, they grew up in New Philadelphia, and they were partly raised by Solomon's wife. So they would have had direct connection to the slave experience and what it was like in the early days of New Philadelphia. But of course, there are stories. My father was kind of he was always a good old boy for most of his life, but he was one of those kids that wanted to get out of Dodge. So the circus came through. He left with the circus. And, but now here's the story. This to tell you something about the freedom thing. The story is somewhere back east, the circus. And then he overheard a story that some white hoodlums captured a black woman and raped her. And then he said, look, where I'm from, New Philadelphia, we would capture him and castrate him. And then later that day, somebody said, you that Negro, they're going to lynch. He just nodded and went directly to the bus station and got his behind back to New Philadelphia. So and it really tells a story, because all of the McWhorters left and came back. Most of them are buried in New Philadelphia. So it's kind of a strange return. And even Thelma and Cordell and Festus, Ellen and Bernice, all of those siblings, they would go back and visit. And as a child, they would take us back. There was an apple festival, which still exists. And there would be a parade. And there was always this connection. And we grew up knowing the names of the families the Glecklers, the Johnsons, the different farming families that were in that area. And Thelma never gave up her membership in the Berry Baptist Church until she died. Every year she'd send her dues and membership fees in. And now my sister has relocated to a community care center in Berry, and she now is a member of the Berry Baptist Church. So we've been members of that church now for, I don't know, 5 generations. They can't get rid of these McWhorters.
I put in the chat an answer to Jeff's question about what's there at the site now. And it's really a very attractive site to visit, not in a snowstorm, but very attractive site to visit. But it's possible to remember Philadelphia without visiting the site, because there are virtual ways to remember. We do a lecture series every summer, which is held on Zoom for the last few years, which goes deeper into different aspects of the history associated with New Philadelphia and of the time. There are these books, there are videos on our website. The book is $20 plus $5 shipping if you want to order it. So if you can get there, do, and if you can't get there, then remember it in these other ways. Join us in remembering it these other ways.
You know, another thing we're trying to get, as Kate has been mentioning, everybody to do genealogy in relationship to this great drama of American history. When we talk to young people in some towns, you know, there's this sort of alienation. Nothing's going on around here. We want to get to the big city, that kind of sentiment. And we want to interest them in really investigating their own town, which may be more interesting than television. You know, they're heroes, they're gangsters, they're celebrations. There's all kinds of stories. Sometimes people don't want to tell these stories, and you have to coax it out of them. But the human experience is to be found everywhere. And that's what I mean by New Philadelphia belongs to all of us. It's not just a story of the McWhorter family or any given family. It's really an American story that should be repeated by the study of every small town. And I hope people who are listening take this seriously, so that where's the historical record of your church? Where's the history of your family? Or maybe I should say not his story, her story. There's all kinds of new thinking we have to get involved with. And don't you agree?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. You said your father, Festus, left to
Yeah.
join the circus.
Yes.
And of course, the circus was there were a lot of circuses that had their center in Quincy. Do you know what circus he went with? And have you consulted with the ISU Circus Collection to see if you can find a trail of that?
No, I haven't, but thank you so very much for that lead, because we'll jump right on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you know how long he was gone with the circus?
I think it was more than a month. Maybe it was 2-3 months.
Well, I think
At
they
least.
might be able to help you. I'm a retired English professor and I love doing this kind of research. But I also work for Books to Benefit here. And if we find anything come in, these are donated books from our community. And then we have sales semi-annually to raise money for literacy. But I have sent rare books all over the United States. So if anything comes in related to New Philadelphia, I'll let you know.
Fabulous.
But I thought of that
fabulous.
because that was a typical young boy, I'm going to go off to the circus, but they can probably tell you which circuses were in the area at the time and what he might have followed. Just an idea. It might not
Wow.
work out, but it's an idea.
Wow. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. It was a wonderful program, by the way. Very insightful. I have notes on a whole page here.
Well, it gives us a charge to tell the story. So thank you for
Do
listening.
you ever
Thanks
speak
for
to
the
high
question.
schools?
Yes, and even grade schools.
Okay.
I'm a emeritus professor myself. Kate is still on the faculty at the University of Illinois, and so you all were in danger of getting a lecture out of the classroom. You know, there's this desire to capture an audience.
Yeah.
So, but we really
You bet.
enjoy making these presentations, and if you have any other opportunities for us to present our story, we
Okay.
certainly would be welcome. To
Well,
do
I'm a
so.
doctorate from Illinois,
Oh,
so
great.
All right.
Go Illini.
Anyway. You bet.
We want to acknowledge a couple of board members who came to the talk. Lonnie Wilson and Carol McCartney are visible to us on the screen as people who listen today. And there may be others. Maybe Charlotte King, another board member who works out of Washington on some of the liaison, on all of the liaison really to Capitol Hill to try to get these bills moved along. So there's descendants and there's local history activists in the Zoom room.
Does anyone have any more questions for the McWhorters before we finish up for tonight? Okay. If not, I do want to thank you. It was a truly excellent presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm hearing from a lot of other people that they did too. So I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. And do please fill out the survey if you have a chance, and I will pass along anything to the McWhorters.
Thank you so much.
Of course. You're getting some applause here in the room. I can-
Okay, good.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Were they?